Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Conservation International session around natural climate solutions from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples. We are delighted that you have taken the time to be with us today for this incredibly important discussion. This webinar is co-organized by Conservation International and Niatero. My name is Mine Degawan, and I am a Kankanaay Igorot from the Cordillera, Philippines. I am also the director of the Indigenous and Traditional Peoples Program at Conservation International. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to cover a few housekeeping items to ensure this event runs smoothly. Upon joining, all attendees will automatically be muted, and your webcam will be turned off and will remain off for the duration of the event. We will have time for your questions following the conversation. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please enter it into the questions drop-down GoToWebinar control panel. Our team behind the scenes will be monitoring your submissions throughout the presentations and will try to answer as many questions during the Q&A as you possibly can. If you would like to maximize the size of your video screen, do so by clicking the screen expander in the upper right-hand corner. Finally, we are recording today's webcast and will share the video with you after this session. And now to the reason why we are here today. CI has been working with Indigenous people since it was founded 30 plus years ago. Our relations with Indigenous peoples is evolving, and we are learning from our interactions with Indigenous peoples. Among the important lessons we have learned is that we need to amplify Indigenous people's voices where these are absent or where they are needed. In the overall climate change discussions, a number of voices are muted or are even completely silenced. Among these voices are those of Indigenous peoples. Despite some advances made by Indigenous peoples in terms of international policy, much remains to be done at the local level to address years of systemic injustice done against them. Indigenous peoples for many generations have lived with the earth, stewarded its resources, and developed a unique set of knowledge systems that have ensured their survival. These knowledge systems are an important source of knowledge as the world seeks solutions to the issues we face today: climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, food shortage, and others. And yet, Indigenous peoples continue to be ignored, worse, dispossessed, and exploited in the name of finding solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss. The new so-called natural climate solutions are being peddled as a lasting answer to climate change. But what is it? Does it mean a change in the mindset of people vis-a-vis nature? Does it recognize Indigenous people's knowledge systems and their collective rights to their territories and resources? Will it address diversity and equity issues? Will it be inclusive of all voices? These are but some of the issues we would like to look into this hour-long conversation between Hindu Ibrahim, who comes from the Mbororo people of Chad. She is a well-known Indigenous activist in the climate change arena and is also now a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And she has recently joined CI as a board member. She is joined by Beverly Longid, a Bontoc Igorot from the Philippines, who is the global coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, who has had many years of defending the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Also joining my sisters is Graham Reed of the Anishinaabe Peoples of Canada, who serves as advisor to the Assembly of First Nations. And he is also the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. To present an overview of what natural climate solutions are, and to facilitate the question and answer part of the conversations, they are joined by Shaila Raglav, who is the CI Vice President for Climate. Shaila leads CI's climate strategy, which emphasizes the critical role of nature in tackling climate change. This is a cross-cutting effort across the institution, wherein we work with more than 30 offices around the world on science, policy, finance, and engagements with communities and governments to design, implement, and support efforts to protect, manage, and restore nature for the benefit of humanity. Over to you, Shaila.
Thank you, Minnie, so much. I'm really delighted to be part of this event and share some reflections on where we are in this moment in time and why the messages and perspectives that you're going to hear today are so important. So I'll start by backing up a bit. It's the first day of Climate Week in New York, and we're in the middle of a global pandemic, but we have an incredible opportunity this week to elevate issues within the climate agenda, but also outside of discussions that are happening here. We've also seen over the last few years awareness grow of an issue that many of us have been speaking about for many years, which is nature-based solutions to climate change. We're going to focus our discussion today on these solutions in particular, which really refer to more broadly the protection, sustainable management, and restoration of both land, our waters, and our oceans. We know that ecosystems store carbon, and when we destroy ecosystems, they release that carbon into the atmosphere. And at the same time, loss of ecosystems mean that we are losing our natural carbon sinks. So in this context, nature-based solutions are really the broader umbrella of actions that address how we manage land for human well-being and for biodiversity. And when we're managing natural ecosystems for a climate mitigation or carbon storage perspective, we call these natural climate solutions. And we know that natural climate solutions are so important that they provide a third or more of the climate solution, but they only receive 2 or 3% of global climate finance. So in our community, in particular on conservation, our main question has been, how do we realize this potential of nature as a climate solution? How do we create the financing mechanisms and the incentives to keep nature more valuable standing than cut down? And our goals within this community have been twofold. On one hand, it's mapping the areas that store the most carbon to understand what are the areas that need to be protected and restored, but also who owns this land. And we've actually found remarkably that, and actually not surprisingly, that a vast amount of our standing carbon stocks are stewarded by Indigenous people. We've also focused on trying to get nature included within country climate strategies or their NDCs, building new financial mechanisms to keep nature protected. But what we're talking about here, whether it's nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions, NBS or NCS, it is more than just these acronyms or theoretical numbers. We know that we're failing. Deforestation rates are going up, environmental activists and defenders are being murdered. And here in the United States, we've been forced to address our colonial past and how our biases about land and natural resource management have affected our approaches to conservation. We've also been compelled to address racism within our work. And so I really think we're in a new era of environmentalism where resilience and justice need to be the most important principles, not economic growth, where sustainability and sustaining the status quo isn't enough. Addressing climate change really isn't just about electric cars or even protecting land. We need to work together to build a more inclusive, just, fair society. That means that we're not just listening to the voices of vulnerable people, but uplifting, acknowledging, and respecting their perspectives as leaders who can teach us. That we not glorify those with financial resources as the saviors, but see solutions emerge from true partnership that's built on respect. And so I truly believe that we're in a turning point in recognizing this importance of a concept, intersectionality. I fundamentally don't believe that we as humanity will be able to solve the climate crisis without addressing the injustices in our society. It really is the future of the climate action movement. And so I'm thrilled to kick off this important discussion by giving the floor to a leader I admire so much, Hindu Omaru Ibrahim, to kick off this discussion to hear Indigenous voices and perspectives on natural climate solutions. At Conservation International, we really thought it was important to have our first major event at New York Climate Week focused on this important topic. I really don't think that there's an issue more critical for the future of nature and humanity. And so I look forward to discussion. I'll see you all soon for the Q&A. Thank you, and over to you, Hindu.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was really wonderful to hear your perspective on nature-based solutions. And of course, it's the first day of the Climate Week in New York. And it is the first time that the Climate Week going virtually. There's also another way of seeing the things if the nature can go virtually in the discussions. But coming to this panel, we all know that the climate change impacted more indigenous peoples and in a different way. We know it's impacting our food security, it's impacting our culture, our identity, our land, territories, resources. At the end of the day, some indigenous peoples are losing their identity because the nature are impacted by climate change. And we also know this have not been taken into account our voices, and Minnie said well in her introductions. Many indigenous peoples are not sitting in the decision-making tables, and they are not taken into considerations. So all those questions we are going to discuss it with my brothers, Grams, and my sister Beverly here are from the indigenous communities and fighting for so long to indigenous people rights and knowledge to get recognized. I'm going to have a conversation with them. If you have any questions, so refer it to the instruction that Minnie gives you. So put it in the chat box or send it to the Q&A directly, and Shayla will come back after these conversations to take your questions. Just from what Shayla said about the nature-based solutions, and how the conservation are considering the nature-based solutions. And we know that the last years where the international communities come and say, oh, nature have a values, so let's call it nature-based solutions. But you, both of you coming from indigenous communities, I'm going to start by you, Grams. What is meaning the nature-based solutions for an indigenous person? Is it the same that the peoples at the international level talking about it? Or what do you think about it?
Wicked. Anian, Bojo, good morning, good evening. It's such an honor to share this circle with all of you and to come to you from Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish lands, what's currently known as Vancouver. And Hindu, I think your question was really important because the way that I understand natural climate solutions is how Indigenous peoples have and continue to interact with the land, water, and air and all of creation. And I think Minnie's point was a little bit about, and your point earlier about the kind of, sexy recognition of nature-based solutions, which to me highlights one thing in that, climate solutions are foundationally about land, who makes decisions on land, and how do we ensure that Indigenous peoples' leadership and connection to land is incorporated into climate solutions. And I've had the opportunity to discuss and learn from elders across the world who talk about this kind of moment of reckoning. And I think Shaila's point about this turning point also necessitates us to consider how are we embedding a process of rebalancing and a rebalancing of our relationships with humans, with non-humans, with the earth. And through that rebalancing, we can think about, what actually are truly nature-based climate solutions or natural climate solutions. And I'm excited to be on this panel with both of you, heavy hitters, and talking about, what I think we've always done.
Thanks, Brother Grants. Yes, rebalancing, that's what Indigenous peoples know. Beverly, what is it from your perspective? Nature-based solutions, what it mean for Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think for Indigenous peoples, when we speak of nature-based or natural climate solutions, this is not a new thing. I mean, the principles of conservation, protection, restoration, and defense are embedded in Indigenous peoples' ways of life, in our traditions, in our culture, in our practices. It is precisely the meaning of what when we say land is life. It's something It's not what others say, like it's the forgotten solution, as if it suddenly just drops out of sky, or suddenly people remember, oh, we need to save the environment. I mean, needless to say, the mere fact that the remaining forests, biodiversity, natural resources that are crucial to our survival as people and to the planet as a whole are found in indigenous peoples' territories. We are practitioners of these so-called natural solutions for centuries, and up to present. But I think the meaning would actually depend on the framework behind these solutions. It can be, I think, mean the further dispossession or marginalization of indigenous peoples if we take it from a perspective of profit, or it could also be a mechanism for our further empowerment and contribution in the economic, political, and development of society as a whole. So I think there should be more discussions when we speak of these solutions. We need to unpack it, and let's be transparent about it, and go beyond mere rhetorics. And that will define the meaning for indigenous peoples.
Exactly. I mean, I can agree more with both of you. The definition of the nature-based solutions actually must come back to indigenous peoples who can tell them what is about it. So just a follow questions for you, Grams. When they talk about nature-based solutions, there is a financial value, like money value behind when they talk at the international level. And I think from indigenous people perspective, are we selling our nature, how it's come? So what do you think about what is the resource management system of indigenous peoples that call it the nature-based solutions? How do we value our nature beyond the financial value? Do you have a talk on this?
Yeah, a great question. My personal feeling is that the last thing we can expect to deal with, a crisis that was essentially caused by capitalism and caused by the kind of overwhelming desire to make profit, is to put all of our eggs in the development of solutions that essentially use the same system. So it's like solving the problems of capitalism with more capitalism. And I think, there are kind of fundamental, I guess, imbalances in how we do that and how we consider, what actually is the problem and then what are the actual solutions. And Beverly's point about land dispossession, I think, comes back to that identification of what is the issue. The issue is that, for hundreds of years, indigenous peoples have been colonized, marginalized, dispossessed of their lands and territories, and only through addressing that history, through the approach and uplifting of their knowledge systems and their practices, can we really seek to kind of rebalance the world. Now, I think just before I get to your question, one point that I wanted to make is that I think it's important to recognize that nature-based solutions cannot be substituted for, meaningful mitigation-oriented action, which is to say that we can't be talking about, the 1/3 of carbon stored in our different carbon sinks around the world without talking about how we're essentially producing so much GHG emissions that even if we had the best sequestration system, it wouldn't enable us to offset that production. And one example that I think of in Canada, recently we've been talking about the notion of planting 2 billion trees. The existence of 2 billion trees does not offset a projected 49% growth of crude oil up until 2040, which is to say that we need to be talking about these things in unison and talking about how they're interrelated to one another. Now, I think your point about kind of resource management, how indigenous peoples live in proximity and in reciprocal relations to the land is extremely important. And last year, before the health pandemic in Canada, we hosted actually a nature-based climate summit, kind of exploring different opportunities within nature-based solutions. And there was a small Indigenous caucus there who, in kind of recognition of the, I guess, exclusion of Indigenous peoples and their lands, prepared their own statement. And there were 2 points that I wanted to highlight from that statement that I think speak to the topic that we're talking about. First, the fact that nature-based solutions conceptualizes humans as separate from nature. It commodifies nature in terms of balance sheets and views the land and water as void of Indigenous peoples and open for development. And real solutions, truly nature-based solutions, require a transformation beyond this mainstream approach towards a paradigm rooted in relationships that value the nexus of land, or people, land, and reciprocity. And so I think that recognition and that nexus is what we're talking about here.
Thank you, Grams. That's the things. I mean, the concept of indigenous peoples, it's not human separately and nature separately. Human and nature as part of our environment, we are just one species. And that needs to be understood by those who are defining the nature-based solutions. Dear Beverly, there are a lot of solutions that they wanted to call nature-based solutions. And there are some false solutions, maybe, who are violating the right of indigenous peoples. As human rights defender and indigenous people rights defenders, what do you think about the nature-based solutions in the concept of human rights? It is reinforcing our rights or destruction, or how we can separate them?
Well, well, for one, I think I would agree with Graham, no, that we really need to look at the roots of the current climate crisis, the current climate emergency, so that we'll be able to come out with appropriate and viable solutions. One, really, it's systemic. We really need to address the system that causes all of these environmental issues. You cannot speak of saving 1/3 of planet, but at the same time allow 2/3 of the planet to be continued to be mined, to continue to be dammed, to continue to be planted with all of these oil palm plantations. So if indeed we need to have a genuine nature-based solutions, this should also take up a position against all of these destructive and extractive projects. Like I understand, like for the case of probably Conservation International, you have this project in Palawan of restoring mangroves. That's fine. That's good. Let's plant mangroves and capture all of these carbons, etc. But it should also take an active position in relation to the 18 mining applications that are operating in the island of Palawan alone. I mean, that's a national scale, and that should also be happening worldwide. We cannot say like plant 1 billion trees in the Philippines but allow the pipelines in Canada, or plant 1 million trees here but allow the burning of the forests in the Amazon. So I think it should really be an overhaul. No, it should be, for me, from a perspective of a human rights defender, it should be people and planet over profit. And it should also be respective of human rights. Unfortunately, at this time wherein you have many indigenous communities resisting the pipelines, resisting the expansion of cattle ranches, resisting dams and mines, most of these are being attacked by a collusion of government and of corporations that are responsible for these industries. Second, now in this time of pandemic, we thought that probably business operations will stop, but then actually it's business as usual, and they had taken advantage of the pandemic to actually, to aggressively implement these destructive projects in indigenous peoples' territories. And I think worldwide, states are now looking into these existing security laws, wherein you have different in the name of counterterrorism, in the name of lockdown to hold the pandemic COVID-19, people are now being restricted. I mean, there's also a lockdown on human rights. And what we fear for indigenous peoples, this assertion of ancestral land rights, this defense of territories can also be misconstrued as an act of terrorism because it's a direct action against existing state policies. So therefore, we see now many land defenders, environment defenders, human rights defenders, indigenous peoples human rights defenders either being killed, being arrested, and being detained. So we should also be able to address that. So when we speak of nature-based or natural climate solutions, it should also address this aspect, no, of the shrinking civic space, and it should also address the issue of an enabling environment, not only for civil society, but communities and people's movements wherever they are. It cannot
Yeah,
be like a separate, you cannot put them in silos. Like this is climate, environment solution, this is human rights, this is economic growth. I mean, all of this, I think, should be taken into consideration. And I think if, as far as we are concerned, indigenous people should be at the core of it.
absolutely.
Can I
I see
jump
that
in
Grams
on
want
that?
to react on it.
Yeah, because I really want to like appreciate and lift up Beverly's points, and it makes me think of something that a friend of and colleague of mine, Ariel Derange, shared about recognizing land protection as indigenous-led mitigation. So like let's start thinking about how the protection of land, not in the circumstance where we're avoiding the nation states projects of development, but actually recognize that as mitigation. Imagine the place that we would be in emissions and the kind of blown targets of countries across the world if indigenous peoples and other human rights defenders weren't protecting the land and preventing development from happening. And I think it's time that we think about that within our framing, and we kind of honor how indigenous peoples are thinking about not only our people, but thinking about
Mhm.
all of our future generations, and making sure and protecting the world around us. So just wanted to kind of lift up that response, and encourage folks like Conservation International to think about that you cannot be neutral in these circumstances. And by advocating for nature-based solutions without kind of acknowledging all the other things that Beverly so aptly put, I think you are indirectly supporting the rest of it. So want to make sure that there's a coherence associated with how we conceptualize the interconnection between, addressing colonization and decolonization, addressing, decarbonization, and addressing kind of capitalism at the same time. And all of these need to be considered together in order to be consistent and in order to empower indigenous peoples.
In this one, Grams, I think both of you talk about participation is very important. And then you said that the colonization is also both of you. But do you think, how do you think that the global discussions can be decolonized, can be integrative? How they can integrate the indigenous people voice, the diversity? I think Shayla's introduction also talk about this equity, discrimination, and justice. So how the global communities can integrate our voices, how they can be decolonized. May you elaborate in this one? I think both of you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can just start quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Beverly, who's much more intelligent than I. I think the starting point is how do we frame, climate? How do we frame the aspirations of climate? How do we frame the avoidance of biodiversity collapse? And the question is, is the goal just about reducing the contributions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, or is it really about creating this future for our future little ones that emphasizes the things that Shyla shared, which is equity, whether racial, indigenous, gender, disability, and also centers kind of the well-being of people and planet. And I think Beverly's point on that is extremely important. You know, one thing that I think is important to recognize is that, you know, the kind of UN and the structures of the UN are often kind of predicated on the erasure of Indigenous nations. You know, Canada, for example, has anywhere from 50 to 70 different Indigenous nations across the country. The revitalization of those nations is ongoing as we kind of respond to and you know, I guess recover from the project of settler colonialism. But you know, we have these practices of setting up, you know, environments in which multiple nation states can exist. What's to say that we can't do the same for Indigenous nations across the country, which is, you know, that model of international contributions and collaboration. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, Beverly.
Well, I think adding to what Graham has mentioned, one, there should be also a change on how governments, how corporations look at Indigenous peoples. We are not only recipients of aid, or we are not that that they need always and always because of our different ways of life. We are not educated in the way others are, and so there's a level also of discrimination on Indigenous people. So always and always they would really not give much importance on what we say. So I think one, there should be a recognition of Indigenous peoples as rights holders, no? And here comes the sensitive issue of the right to self-determination, wherein we are able to chart our own economic, political, social, cultural development, but alongside with other sectors and groups in society. And definitely at the core of this will be the recognition of land rights, no? And this goes back to recognizing Indigenous peoples not only as rights holders, but also as development actors in our own right, that we have something to contribute. We might not have this PhD or a master's degree or all of these things that can understand these computations in relation to carbon sequestration. I was going through all of this literature, and honestly, I don't understand these measurements. But I know for a fact that what our elders taught us about intergenerational rights, about common good, these values are very important today. So I think as long as they always discriminate us, I mean, the things that we can contribute will not be given importance, and we will not be brought into the table of decision making. In fact, it's not only a question of decision making; it's participation and contribution from the start to the end. So as if that is not being given to us, then always and always we will always be relegated. But I think the better challenge, and I think I'm proud of it as a member of the Indigenous peoples, that we are moving forward. I mean, we are seeing a greater assertion of Indigenous peoples in different parts of the globe of their rights locally, nationally, but we're also seeing a greater solidarity among Indigenous peoples. I mean, never did I know that at one point I'll be protesting also the pipelines that we are done in Canada, or the burning in and all of these things. No, I mean, that's one thing I think that Indigenous peoples should be proud of, because of our common assertion and solidarity. And hopefully, I mean, let's keep pushing, let's keep on asserting and defending, and then probably, I hope it's not too late for government to listen to our contributions.
Totally agree. We all went to the Standing Rock. We all went to the dam in Canada, all to the human rights defenders in Philippines. So we all standing up together, and this is the way of having our voices included. Before that, we move to the questions and answer that will be take it over by Sheila. I wanted to ask you if there is 3 main things that governments or intermediate organizations or NGOs or donors that should consider to include into the nature-based solution, who can be better designed to empower communities, what that will be.
Yeah, I
Go ahead,
can.
Graham.
Both of you going to say rights, but go ahead.
Yeah, definitely like ensure the appropriate inclusion of kind of human rights and indigenous rights safeguards with, some form of accountability mechanism for, any sorts of violations of those rights. One of the points that Beverly raised, kind of the right to self-determination, as embedded in different international covenants that have occurred over the last, 50 or 60 years. And the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was just a recognition, an international recognition of the rights already possessed by Indigenous peoples across the globe. I think it's important to acknowledge that, if we don't take this kind of rights-based approach, we essentially risk kind of repeating the, conservation movement of kind of the early 1900s until now. And in Canada, it was where there were, forcible relocalization of Indigenous peoples from their lands to make way for, pristine nature. And so there's like this, inherent racism associated with the conservation kind of mentality without, I think, addressing the things that Shyla shared in her introductory presentation, which is to be inclusive and equitable and acknowledge kind of the history associated with it. And I think also it's important to, kind of recognize and understand the difference between, free, prior, informed consent and the kind of veto framing that, lots of proponents and governments are concerned about Indigenous peoples having, which is essentially the process to decision making that, Indigenous people should have. So, encourage folks to avoid that kind of, falsification of the decision-making powers afforded to Indigenous peoples as self-determining peoples and nations. The things that I would say that are important is also just about recognizing that, these projects and that conservation is Indigenous driven and that it's led by Indigenous institutions. I think we're at the point where, and Shyla and Hindu talked about it, that, large kind of CSOs speak on behalf of Indigenous people, and Minnie shared it in the introduction. It's about, empowering and facilitating space for Indigenous peoples to lead their own solutions. Here, one of the teachings that we have in the prairie provinces is about kind of the grass dancer, which is to say, the grass dancer prepares the area for ceremony and then enables, other Indigenous peoples, other First Nations to enter that to conduct ceremony. And I think, the role of somebody like CI or other large institutions is to open up that space that enables Indigenous peoples to decide what they want to do. And, the decision of Indigenous peoples is not just about, adaptation solutions, right? I think we said earlier how, adaptation solutions are inherently linked to food security, to water security, to energy security, to, practicing our language, practicing our culture, revitalizing who we are as people. And the sooner that we think about climate as those different activities, the sooner we can make space for the efforts led by Indigenous peoples. And, I think those are kind of basic starting points for, what donors can do. And also, encourage them and different governments to kind of look internally about, who is leading and making decisions on behalf of their organization. And I think, now, given the time that Shyla shared, is important point of reflexivity for institutions to really look inwardly and think about who's represented on their executive team, who's making decisions in the field, how are you embedding the principles of equity, racial or Indigenous or gender or disability, all of which are kind of central themes to, I think, the things that both Beverly and I spoke about today.
Thanks. So I think just to resume your three things to donors, government, or NGOs or whatever to the nature-based solutions: right-based approach, accountability, inclusiveness to decision making. Beverly, you have some other points to add to those, I believe.
Well, yes. Well, I agree with Graham. No, we should learn lessons from history and this past failure of many so-called solutions, and it's really important that we give justice, no, to those who have been victimized by these false solutions. Probably one is that we should also have, I mean, the domestic laws that we have should also have teeth in it. Because most of the laws actually, I mean, they're easily violated by corporations or even by government itself, because the punishment is, you know, it's just like probably a few $100 that the companies can very well pay. We should have really teeth. We should put teeth into environmental protection laws so that we'll be able to prosecute the real offenders. And I agree, transparency and accountability is very important so that you will have open and public information on the processes of these projects, whether these are mines or nature-based and solutions. And probably when you speak of funding, because the way I understand it at the moment, that most of the funds go actually to big NGOs, to big civil society organizations who function as I don't know, manager or middleman of these solutions, and not directly to communities or even to indigenous peoples organizations themselves. Now, if it's a question of indigenous peoples not having the capacity to manage these funds, then I think we should be able to capacitate indigenous peoples to manage this, or let us not make the assumption that we cannot manage these resources, so that we do away with, you know, NGOs doing the negotiations for communities or indigenous peoples. And in fact, if the way I hope that not most of the funds will go actually to salaries of foreign consultants or project managers, etc. And it's really very important also, I think, that we still continue an active information or awareness building on the situation and rights of indigenous people, so that they will be able to understand why indigenous peoples are asserting these rights to ancestral lands and self-determination, so that we shall not be branded as, you know, as anti-development or people that want to go back to Stone Age. We don't want electricity, we don't want cell phones and all of these things. So I think that should still be a continuing thing, no, especially for indigenous peoples. And actually, for hopefully when the pandemic is the lockdowns in relation to pandemic is lifted, I would actually invite these donors or even these big conservation groups to visit and integrate with indigenous peoples communities, to be able to understand, you know, how we live, how we, I mean, to get a better understanding of the values that we are espousing when we speak of protection, conservation, and all of these things. But I think at the core of it really is recognizing indigenous peoples as partners in development, that we have to contribute, so that this so-called, what do you call it, multi-stakeholder things should include indigenous people, especially when we're speaking of climate solutions, because again, we cannot overemphasize this, the remaining resources that are crucial for our survival as people and planet are indigenous people's territories. And you cannot just simply say indigenous people's sacrifice or give up for majority of our national development. It should also mean the survival of us indigenous peoples, not only of wider society.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for these great discussions. Just so we need to right best approach, accountability, inclusiveness to the decision making, give justice and dignity, proper policies implementation, transparency, direct access to funding to the communities, and capacity to negotiate directly for them own interests. Those can guide the nature-based solutions. So I'm going to give Shayla to manage the question and answer. And sorry to be long, we are indigenous, we talk about nature-based solutions. Thank you so much, both of you, Beverly and Grams. Over to you, Shayla. We are all ready to respond.
Great. Thank you so much, Hindu, Graham, and Beverly, for that really rich discussion. We have a lot of questions flooding in, so we're going to keep it to our top 3 questions, and would appreciate if you could keep your responses brief so that we can get as much possible in before we conclude. So the first question is from an audience member from Colombia. So how do you consider the violence against Native and Indigenous people should be addressed? This is a very critical issue in Colombia in particular. So what are you observing in terms of trends on violence against Indigenous people increasing, and how can that be addressed? So maybe we can, each of you can respond. We'll start with Graham, Beverly, and then Hindu.
Yeah, Miigwech, and thanks, Shaila, for sharing that question. You know, I think my response is that this just further demonstrates to me why nature-based solutions cannot be thought as kind of neutral entities that, you know, don't consider the protection and upholding of Indigenous rights. And, you know, the kind of violence against Indigenous peoples in the protection of their lands and territories speaks to that point about kind of accountability and, you know, I guess what's the correct word? Like the ability to bring legal challenges against those entities, whether government or corporations, to do that. And want to just end my comment by saying, you know, one example of that is Canadian mining companies, which continue to express violently against Indigenous peoples and other human rights defenders standing up for their lands and waters, and that needs to end.
Thank you, Graham. Beverly?
But I think for one, we condemn this violence and attacks against the indigenous peoples in Colombia and other parts of Latin America, and we stand in solidarity in their fight for justice and recognition of their rights. And probably a way of probably giving solidarity is that if we can get the situation, no, and help them amplify the situation that's happening in Colombia, we'd be very glad and to do that. And probably in our efforts, as you said, this is Environment Week, and we're running towards the celebration of the 75th year of the United Nations, and what we can do to maximize these existing avenues or mechanisms, human rights mechanisms in the UN to bring justice and attention to the plight of the indigenous peoples in Colombia. Again, we stand in solidarity with you, and we call the same to stop the attacks against indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Beverly. Hindu?
Yeah, in support to what Grams and Beverly said, but I visited Colombia and I visited indigenous communities, many of them around the forest. And then I know that Colombia, it's signed for the zero deforestations by 2020. So that must be maybe a policy that can guide to reduce all the conflict among the communities. If they recognize the land rights of indigenous peoples there, they recognize also the effort that I saw by my eyes, the communities restoring the forest with the indigenous trees, where they create a corridor between the primary forest and the secondary forest in order to restore the ecosystem with all the nurseries. So if they implement the knowledge of indigenous peoples and they put the right legislations, I think the conflict among indigenous peoples or to the indigenous peoples can be ended.
Great. Thank you all for your responses. I'll move on to the next question. So is there any place or example where this has been done right? Are there any success stories where you've seen public-private partnerships with indigenous communities working together in a true collaborative approach that is a dynamic that respects and fully values the contributions of indigenous peoples? Can you speak to any of those examples?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
Or were you going to share with somebody else? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, one example, you know, I think my recognition is that the first relationship needs to occur between, you know, the government and the indigenous nation, and then we can talk about how are their partnerships with different corporations. But in Canada, there's kind of an emerging concept, well, long-standing for Indigenous peoples, called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, which is essentially one tool to give jurisdiction and authority back to Indigenous peoples over their lands and waters. One example of that recently is the Taidene Nene Reserve in the kind of Northwest Territories, southern half of the Great Slave Lake, which was a recognition of Letzoke First Nation giving back authority to them to then choose to interact with whoever they want. Another example, not far from here on Vancouver Island, is the Mears Island Tribal Park, which has essentially enabled Indigenous peoples to build their own economies with surrounding municipalities, corporations, and also the provincial and federal government. So there are these things in existence, and there are examples of once the government recognizes that right to land and the self-determination of land, then Indigenous peoples can negotiate with corporations or entities that are seeking to access those lands. And I think, as indicated earlier, that's the kind of fundamental step, is to recognize the decision making of Indigenous peoples in their lands and territories, and then they can decide what they want to do, right? Like, I think all of us have shared that Indigenous people should be equipped with the ability to make their own decisions.
Thank you, Graham. Beverly?
I'm having difficulty of thinking of a good example, but anyway, probably at a micro level, we've had this experience in the Cordillera of being able to build micro or mini dams in our communities, that with support from the local government unit, and of course with some private sector, even foreign governments, financial and technical assistance from foreign governments and NGOs. And this was able to harness the natural flow of the river, of the water system, being able to provide electricity for the entire community, even at a rate wherein it is the principle of equity is applied, wherein not because you can afford to have more lights, more light bulbs, you get to have more, but then you have at least one family should only have a maximum of this number of watts, so that everybody gets to do it. And it was also able to produce enough electricity or energy to be able to operate a rice mill, to be able for the rice production. Another case that I know of is our ongoing program in Mindanao, wherein we were able to set up again in a multi-stakeholder partnership what we call Indigenous Peoples schools, wherein we're able to teach not only reading, writing, and mathematics in their native language, but being also able to enhance the appreciation of the children in relation to culture. And it also, part of the curriculum was on sustainable agriculture. We were able to, a few hundred schools in Mindanao. Unfortunately, with the increasing attacks against Indigenous peoples, more than around 178 schools were closed down, denying education to several thousands of Indigenous children. But because of these examples and our experience, it's really viable that we have sustainable and self-determined development if we do put into practice all of the principles that we've discussed much earlier with the session with Hindu. So if we can do that at that level, why not? As long as human rights, all of these principles are given recognition, given respect, it can work.
Thank you, Beverly. And last word to you, Hindu.
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible. I give you the example of Yawanawa communities in Brazil. So I meet them and then discuss with them. They are the one who are negotiating directly with the companies on the mining or protecting on them lands. So they can tell them, you do that or you do not do that. And then the benefit sharing is directly going to the communities. It's helped them to do all the development that they need in this place. But it is very few example of the best practices. That's directly with the company. And in chat with my community, I know in 2010, I did a study between the governments and myself as consultants on educations of our nomadic children. So that's helped to create a specific direction for nomadic educations. So it's really unique in all Africa. We have this direction. And with the specific curricula that, like Beverly is saying earlier, we do not go to the school to learn only mathematics, but we learn also the specific management of land natural resources. It can work if the right best approach is there, and if indigenous people can take the decision in them land, in them territories, and decide.
Well, thank you to all three of you for your reflections here. I think it's the onus is on all of us to work together with Indigenous communities to try to ensure that there's more good examples. I think we're out of time. We're coming to the top of the hour, so I'll just quickly wrap up and summarize with a few reflections. You know, I think I was really taken by a lot of the comments that you made, and I think that there's so much that we can do to integrate your perspectives into our global strategy, narrative, and dialogue on natural climate solutions. I was really compelled by the statement that nature-based solutions cannot be a substitute for a wholeness or a holistic position that actually stands up and speaks about how other practices that are destroying and extracting from our land, we really need to reframe our paradigm or our relationship with land as one that's not exploitative or even sustaining, but we actually need to focus more on regenerative, restorative, not only in terms of how we manage land, but how we treat one another. So I think that was a really important concept that came across in the conversation. Also, this idea of indigenous-led mitigation. It's not corporate mitigation or government mitigation on the behalf of indigenous people. It's indigenous people who are actually stewards and leaders in their own right of these approaches and perspectives, both mitigation but also adaptation. And then also speaking to the importance of direct access, rights-based approach, more inclusive conversations and accountability, and how we can integrate these principles also in global climate dialogues. I have learned a lot, and I hope that our audience also has valued and taken all of your wisdom from this conversation. I hope we can continue these dialogues among one another, but also take them into the forums and the platforms and the people that need to hear this message. And I hope that we can amplify each other's voices. So wishing you all a very successful Climate Week, and would also like to just let everybody know that this conversation is recorded and will be posted on our website, on Conservation International's Climate Week website. So thank you to our speakers, Graham, Beverly. Thank you, Hindu, for moderating this conversation. Thank you to Nia Tero for your partnership in this event, and Minnie Degawan for leading the charge within Conservation International on ensuring that our approaches to natural climate solutions are responsive to the wisdom of Indigenous communities. Thank you very much, and looking forward to continuing this dialogue.
Thanks, Shayla. Bye.
See you. See you, Hindu. See you, Graham and Shyla.
Yeah,
and the
thanks
rest of
everyone.
the IT,
And we
Minnie.
the opportunity.
So good night.
Bye.
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 Thank you all.
How do
Bye.
we leave the room?